So whenever I go on an extended road trip, there are certain things I like to do to try and pass the time. Now, when I was a kid, you couldn't do any of these things. So you kind of had to entertain yourself. And so remember what that was like. You know, you might play the alphabet game with the people that are in the car, or look for different license plates. Or there was a game my grandpa taught me that I've been trying to teach my kids called "You Sit There and Be Quiet While I Drive." And they've not caught on yet, but maybe someday in the future. But today it's different. Today, while the kids are watching a DVD in the back, I've got 2 or 3 different things I like to do. So one of the things I like to do is I'll find a musical artist and I'll type their name into Spotify and I'll listen to 20 or 30 straight songs by that one musical artist. Another thing I like to do is sometimes I'll listen to these really lengthy, kind of boring podcasts. So on the way home from the beach last week, I listened to a 2-hour lecture, a guy talking about the causes of World War I, from the Congress of Vienna to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So it was about as riveting as it sounds. So if you'd like to, download that, I'll help you after the service. But the other thing I like to do, and I bet I'm not the only person in the room that does this, if I'm going somewhere where I have to use the GPS, as soon as you input the information and that GPS comes back with the expected time of arrival, I take it as a personal challenge to beat that time. Even if I have to stop. As soon as I get back in the car, I'm getting ready to try to shave some minutes off that. So I took a screenshot. If we go to the next one, you can see if we were to leave First Christian Church and drive to Gulf Shores, Alabama, where we just got back from, you would see our expected time of arrival. And there's just something about seeing that on the screen that triggers something in me that thinks, I have to beat this or my entire life has been a failure. And my boys will never talk to me again. Now, I don't think that's true, but there's just something that feels that way. And so if I'm driving somewhere and I get caught in traffic or, you get run into some construction on the interstate like you always do, I don't know how it is for you, but I can physically feel my blood pressure increasing as the minutes on that GPS tick the wrong direction. Some of you can relate to that. Now, keep in mind that most of the time when I'm going somewhere, there's no deadline. It's not like if I don't beat this time, something terrible is going to happen. It's just that, like a lot of you, when I get something on my mind, I have a hard time letting it go. Now, keep that in mind and turn in your Bible to Exodus 19. As Anita mentioned, this morning we're continuing our deep dive into the life of Moses. And as we've talked about over these last few weeks, Moses was a guy who spent a lot of time in the spotlight, but before he ever stepped into the spotlight, there were some things that had to happen in the shadows for God to help him to become the person that he was created to be. And as we pick up the story this morning in Exodus 19, Moses finds himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to lead the people of Israel to a new place. The problem is he has no idea how long it's going to take for them to arrive at their destination. If you could somehow put in the GPS information tracking their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, a place called Canaan, you would immediately see that the total distance is not that far. In fact, I did it this week, and it's only 529 miles from where they started to where they were going, which is shorter than the distance from here to Gulf Shores, Alabama. But if you've been tracking with us, and you know that as he often does, rather than sending them on the most direct route, God sends them the long way around. If you traced it on a map, it looks like they go way far out of the way where they're constantly rerouting, and the only thing under where it says expected time of arrival is a big question mark because nobody knows. And as Exodus 19 opens, it's now been 90 days since they left Egypt. And during those 3 months, there's been a lot of things that have happened. A lot of work has been done. But Moses is starting to figure out that there's still a lot of work left to do. And to make it even more frustrating, he has no idea how long it's going to take. But in the first 2 verses of Exodus 19, Moses looks up and he finds himself back in a place that was already intimately familiar to him. Check this out, verse 1 of Exodus 19. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. So make sure you catch that last line where it says they camped there in front of the mountain. Now, some of you remember this. If you go back to Exodus 3, this is the exact same spot where Moses had heard from God in the form of this burning bush. And it was there that God had given him this promise that we see in Exodus 3. And it goes like this. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now keep in mind, this is a promise that can only be experienced after he had taken the risk of going back to Egypt, confronting the Pharaoh, and then leading the Israelite people out of Egyptian slavery and into freedom. And now he looks up, and in a very real sense, he is right back where he started. This is the place he spent 40 years watching sheep. This is the place he met his wife. This is the place that he first heard from God. And after everything he's been through, after everything he's already accomplished, he looks up and he's right back in the starting position. Some of you might be able to relate to that. You ever felt like you were going in circles, heading nowhere fast, only to wind up right back where you started? That's where Moses was. And some of you know how frustrating that can be. So you apply for a job, and you don't hear anything, and you're not sure you're going to hear anything. And so every day you get up and you go right back to where you started. Or you've been desperate for a new relationship, and the phone's not ringing, so every night you sit in the same spot that you've always sat in, desperate for something new. Maybe you've been trying to have a baby only to endure multiplied months of, so now you're not sure if it's ever going to happen. Or maybe you've been trying really hard to get your life together and get in a better place, find something different, and you've tried to do everything you know how to do, and nothing seems to be working, and you're still in the same spot you were in when you started, and you're not sure it's ever going to turn around. Each week throughout this series, we tried to give you one big idea that summarizes this part of Moses' story. And for this week, here's the big idea I want to draw your attention to. It's that intimacy develops best in hard places. Say it again. Intimacy develops best in hard places. I've got a map I want to show you. You've seen it before. And one of the questions that it's normal to ask whenever you read through the story of the Exodus is why didn't God take them on the shortest route? Like you can see it up there, the blue line. That would have been the shortest route to get from point A to point B. And the Bible does tell us there was a group of people there that lived in the middle called the Philistines, but they weren't nearly as powerful or as intimidating as the Egyptians. So it's not like God couldn't have helped the Israelites overcome the Philistines. So you have to wonder, what was God up to? What was he trying to do? Why did he send them so far out of the way and keep them there for so long? And I think it's something very simple. I think it's as simple as after 430 years of slavery, there were some things that he wanted the Israelites to know that they could only learn out in the desert. It's kind of just like Moses, kind of parallels his experience. Remember, he started out the first 40 years of his life. He's a prince of Egypt. He lives in the Pharaoh's home. He has access to the best of everything. But then at the age of 40, he loses his temper. He kills an Egyptian. He's forced to flee to the desert of Midian, where he spends the next 40 years of his life. And you could look at that and you could say, Moses was being punished for making a wrong decision. He lost his temper, and now he has to pay the consequences of his action. But I don't think it was all punishment. In fact, I think it was mostly a time of preparation. I think there were some things that God wanted Moses to know, and some skills that he wanted him to develop that he could only develop while he was living out in the desert, in the shadows, in obscurity. The great writer A.W. Tozer said it like this. He said, God does his deepest work in our darkest hours. And you think back over your experience with God, there's probably some truth of that you could tell us about. I don't know why we do it, but for some reason, for a lot of us, it's not until like the bottom has completely fallen out and there's nowhere to turn and we're completely trapped. It's not until the wheels completely come off that we're ready to listen to what God has to say. And that's exactly what happened to Moses, and I think it's exactly what happened to Israel. And one of the things that's important to understand is that this was not an overnight camping trip. Like when Exodus says that they camped in front of the mountain, this was a season that lasted for 11 long months. But it wasn't wasted time. Instead, it was time that they spent deepening their understanding of who God is and what God expects in preparation for when they finally reached their destination. For Moses in particular, the 11 months they spent camping there were time that he spent developing an even deeper intimacy with God in preparation for what was going to be required of him the last 40 years of his life. By this point, Moses has figured out the only hope he has and the only hope the people of Israel have is if they can learn to go deeper in their relationship with God. So how do you do that? How do you develop the kind of intimacy with God that keeps you going when you're in the desert, but also prepares you for what God has called you to do? As you look at Exodus 19, there are three things in particular that will help you. Here's the first one. In order to grow closer to God, you have to embrace your new identity. Now keep in mind, for 430 years, the Hebrew people had lived as slaves. That means there's not one person outside of Moses that's a part of this whole operation that's ever made a decision. There's not one person that knows what it's like to be free. And so for them, the first step in this process of going deeper is going to require God to remind them of who they had been, not of who they'd been, but of who they were created to be. And I want you to look at how he does this, starting in verse 3. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you're to speak to the Israelites." Verse 7. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. Now there are three words here that God uses to describe the Israelite people. And each word is meant to communicate how he views them. So if you're keeping track, here's the first word he uses. It's the word treasure. He says, "You are my treasured possession." You remember what it was like when you were a kid and somebody chose you to be on their team? Or maybe you remember what the pain of not being chosen. Or maybe you've been chosen to receive some kind of award or some kind of bonus at your job. If you multiply that times about 1,000,000, you're getting close to what God is trying to communicate to the people of Israel. The second word he uses is the word priest. In verse 5, he calls them a king, or verse 8, he calls them a kingdom of priests. Now, priest is somebody that forms kind of like this human bridge. They represent God to the people, and they intercede with God for the people. So by calling them a kingdom of priests, he's telling them that they've got a special role to play, that he wants to bless the entire world through them. And then the last word he uses is the word holy. Now, to be holy means to be set apart. And in verse 6, it's the first time in the Bible that the word holy is used to describe a person. Up until this point, it's always been used to describe something rather than someone. But in this instance, God used to describe not just someone, but an entire group of people. Now, here's what's so crazy about this. If you fast forward to the New Testament, the Apostle Peter takes these same three descriptions that are found in Exodus 19, and he applies them not just to the people of Israel, but he applies them to us. Look at how he does this. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light." Now, if you know the backstory, then you know that at the moment God spoke these words to Moses, none of those things looked like they were true. I mean, you look at the Israelite people, they're out in 2 million refugees kind of going in circles out there in the desert. They don't look anything like a treasured possession. They don't look anything like a kingdom of priests, and they certainly don't look anything like a holy nation. Instead, they look like a group of people who get it wrong more than they get it right. They look like a group of people who are stuck going in circles and are not making a whole lot of progress. And in that sense, they looked a lot like us. And here's what's so cool about this. The way God describes them is not as they are, but as how he created them to be. And as hard as it is to sometimes believe, according to the Apostle Peter, the same thing that was true of the people of Israel is also true of us. When God looks at us, he doesn't see us as we were, or even as we sometimes still are. Instead, he sees us as he created us to be. And part of the process of becoming who he created you to be is learning to let go of your old identity and embrace the new identity that he wants to give you. Now, here's the second step in developing this closer relationship with God. After you embrace your new identity, you have to establish a rhythm. Now, I told you earlier that this period in which the Israelites were camped in front of Mount Sinai lasted for 11 months. It's one of two kind of extended camping seasons that you read about in the book of Exodus. Later on, they camp at a place called Moab for almost a year. And as I mentioned earlier, on the surface, that sounds weird, right? I mean, you're trying to get from point A to point B as fast as you can, the fastest route possible. It doesn't make sense that you would stop and camp for over a year. But I think the reason they do that is because it's during those extended camping trips, 11 months in one place, a year in another place, when they hit the brakes and it looks like they're not making any progress and nothing much is happening, that God speaks to them most clearly. Victor Hamilton said it like this. He said, "It is when Israel halts the travels and puts down stakes into the ground, at least for a while, that the Lord's word to Israel becomes most extensive and most compelling." Now, for those of you that are kind of Old Testament scholars, it's interesting that during these 11 months that Moses and the Israelites spent there at Mount Sinai, God gave Moses enough material that he later wrote 58 chapters that were included in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And all of that happened because it was during that season that Moses established this rhythm that allowed him to develop a deeper intimacy with God. And you can see what I'm talking about if you look closely. For example, back in verse 3, it says, "Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain." Now, keep in mind, all the people are at the base of the mountain. So that's where all the action is. If you wanted to know what was going on, you had to go to the base of the mountain. But Moses somehow knew if he was going to hear from God, he had to separate himself from all the activity, get away from all the people, and go up on the mountain where it's quiet and where he can listen. Then at the end of verse 8, it says that after talking to the people, what's Moses do? He once again goes back up to the mountain to talk with God. And then you get to verse 9, and one of the most incredible verses in the entire Bible shows up. Check this out, verse 9. "Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. So have you ever wondered what God's voice sounds like? I always think of James Earl Jones, the famous actor. Or maybe one of those old school announcers that used to do the promos for the action movies. They're telling you what's going to happen. I don't know what it sounds like, but whatever it sounds like, it's something that's completely and instantly recognizable. And later on, in Deuteronomy 4, the Bible tells us that at least in this instance, even the people down in the camp at the base of the mountain heard God's voice as he spoke to Moses. God didn't want there to be any confusion about what was going on. And so he let the people eavesdrop on the conversation that he was having with Moses. As you keep reading Exodus, you're going to discover that this becomes the ongoing pattern of Moses' life. He separates himself from the crowd. He goes up on the mountain. God speaks. Moses then goes back down the mountain. He tells the people what God said. Then he goes back up the mountain, and God speaks again. Then he goes back down, and he tells the people. And that becomes sort of the repeating cycle of his life. And if you're anything like me, you might be tempted to read this and think to yourself, man, I wish it worked like that for me, right? Like maybe you've been praying about something, so man, I've been waiting my entire life for God to tell me something, and as far as I know, he's never said anything to me. But here's what I don't want you to miss about this. Part of the reason Moses heard from God so often is because during those years in the desert, Moses established a rhythm that allowed him to listen for God's voice. So here's the thing. There's nothing you can do to force God to speak to you. Like there's no magic formula. There's no prayer you can pray. There's nothing you can do. There's no ritual you can perform that God automatically is going to speak to you. But here's what you can do. Over time, you can establish certain rhythms that will put you in a position to hear from God if he chooses to speak. So with that in mind, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with yourself. How many times during a normal week do you separate yourself from the crowd, turn off all the noise, take out the AirPods and turn off Netflix and fold up the laptop and put the iPad down and turn the radio off and all that stuff, and take out your Bible and listen for God to speak to you? See, one of the problems that a lot of us have, and I'm guilty of this too, is that we spend so much of our lives waiting for God to speak to us without realizing that he's already spoken through the pages of the Bible. One writer said, when you open your Bible, God opens his mouth. So with that, let me ask you again, how many times in the last few days have you put yourself in a position to hear from God should he choose to speak? So if you want to develop the kind of relationship with God that can sustain you during those desert times, those hard places, and also prepare you for what God created you to do, you're going to have to establish a rhythm where you can actually hear from God on a regular basis. And that leads right to the third step you see in this process, and that's as you try to go deeper in your relationship with God, you have to prepare for each encounter. So you get to verse 10, and you come to a part of the Bible where admittedly, a lot of us start to tune out. I know you're not supposed to admit this, but like you start your Bible reading plan, at the beginning of the year in January, and you read pretty good, and you do all right, and then you get to Exodus 19, verse 10, and you start to zone out, right? You either start skipping chapters or skipping days because it seems like it's just a bunch of arbitrary rules. But what you have to understand is the purpose behind all these rules. So if you got your Bible open, verse 10 of Exodus 19, here's what it says. And the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They're to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day, abstain from sexual relations. So God promises Moses, hey, 3 days from now, I'm going to show up on this mountain myself. But he wants them to know that his presence is not something to be taken lightly. And so he tells them to do 3 things in particular. So I want you to wash your clothes, make sure nobody touches the mountain, because if they touch the mountain, they're going to die, and abstain from sex. So they do those things, and you get to verse 16, and the most incredible thing happens, and God himself shows up. Listen how this goes down. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "These people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us, put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." They have these 3 days that they spend in intense preparation for something that they never could have predicted. One writer called this a display of cosmic disruption. It was the kind of thing that once you saw it, you never forgot it. It was also the kind of thing that as it was happening, you were afraid to look at it, but you were also afraid to look away from it. And just for a moment, I want you to compare the entire scene that we just read to the way most of us approach worship. Now, I know it's true. When we gather here on Sundays, we normally don't experience any thunder and lightning. Like unless one of the storms hits between 9 a.m. and noon, and you're here at the right time. And most time that doesn't happen. And most of the time, or at least to my memory, we don't hear any trumpet blasts. Now, I've thought about that time or two, like when I'm preaching on the return of Jesus, just have somebody blow a trumpet in the balcony just to scare everybody to death. But that normally doesn't happen either. And you think about the last thing happening. There's been times, over the years, on especially big Sundays, when you kind of feel the balcony shake. But I've never felt the building itself tremble violently. So there's this sense in which you could read about what they experience, and you could compare it to what we normally experience. You could say those are two different things, but that'd be wrong. One of the things the Bible teaches is that God shows up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes he comes in the form of a violent storm. Sometimes there's thunder and lightning and trumpet blast and everything shakes. Other times he comes in the form of a gentle whisper. And what that means is that every Sunday, when we gather to worship, we're gathering for the intended purpose of encountering God. Later on in the New Testament, you get to Hebrews chapter 12, which that whole part of Hebrews, if you go back and read it, is kind of a sermon based on what happened here in Exodus 19. And I want you to listen or look with me at how the writer to the Hebrews explains all this. Here's what he writes. "You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged that no further word be spoken to them. Because they could not bear what was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death." The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, "I am trembling with fear." That's kind of their experience. And then he starts talking about what should be our experience. "But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." Did you catch what he's saying? He's saying that because of what Jesus did on the cross, you and I are invited to experience something that's even more life-changing and more powerful than anything the people of Israel could have ever imagined. The problem, though, for most of us, is that because we don't realize the magnitude of the invitation, we just take it for granted. And we do it over and over. I'm not trying to beat you up because I'm guilty of this, but so many times we approach worship as if, hey, it's just one more thing we got to mark off the list. It's on the schedule. If I don't go, I'm going to feel guilty. And so we show up and we sit in our spot and we just kind of go through the motions and we think about all kinds of other stuff. Just like when you're in a car and you're trying to pass the time, we're trying to pass the time so we can go on and do whatever it is that we like to do. And most of the time we can go through, if we're not careful, we'll go through an entire worship service without ever really engaging. We're just kind of there and we're trying to get credit for attendance, but we're not actually worshiping. And what we forget is that because of what Jesus did, man, every single opportunity to worship is a chance to encounter him. So I want you to stand with me. This morning I asked Jamie to change up the order of service just a little bit because I wanted all of us to have an opportunity to do something besides just go through the motions. So, and sometimes you know how this works. Sometimes all it takes is somebody reminding you of something for you to realize something needs to change. So for these next few minutes, I'm going to invite you to really, really worship with us. One of the things I hope you've seen in this part of Moses' story is that if you really want to grow deeper, you want to go deeper, you want to be more intimate in your relationship with God, then you have to establish a rhythm of worship, and then you have to prepare to encounter him at these critical moments. And you're not going to have a better opportunity this week to do either of those things than you're going to have over these next few moments. So as our worship team leads us, I want you to try to eliminate distractions, allow yourself to really worship God for who he is and what he's done. At the same time, if you're here and you know you're kind of at step one, ground zero, and you don't really have a relationship with God, we'd be glad to talk with you, to pray with you, to answer any questions that you might have. All you need to do is just meet us down here on this front row during these songs, and we'll walk you through whatever you need to do.